Long before modern psychology named introversion or burnout, the Bible recorded a repeating behavior it treated as a warning sign, not a personality trait. And Proverbs states it directly. Whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment, marking a voluntary separation as a behavioral turn, not a neutral state. Across the record, this inward move appears before collapse, before distortion, before connection fails completely. Because once a person stops being shaped by others, perception tightens and correction disappears. Being alone often feels clean, controlled, even wise. But the biblical record documents something unsettling, that prolonged withdrawal reshapes how reality is interpreted, which is why ancient warnings didn't begin with chaos or crowds. They began with the quiet choice to be unseen, unheard, and untouched. Because once isolation becomes identity, damage no longer registers as damage at all. When people talk about preferring to be alone, they describe it as relief, as clarity, as avoiding noise. But behavior patterns show something else forming underneath, because withdrawal begins as reduction. Fewer conversations, fewer interruptions, fewer chances to be challenged. And over time, that reduction changes how reality itself is experienced. The Bible's records show it starting quietly, someone stepping back just enough to stop being shaped, just enough to stop being corrected, just enough to feel safe inside their own perspective. And once that happens, the internal world starts feeling more trustworthy than anything external. This is why isolation shows up so early in the pattern, because before beliefs change, before actions escalate, before consequences are visible, the person has already narrowed the field of influence around them. And nothing extreme has happened yet, which is exactly why it goes unnoticed. What makes this pattern difficult to detect is nothing looks broken at first. Isolation presents as preference, energy management, self-knowledge, and the person withdrawing believes they're becoming more stable, not less. But the moment external voices fade, internal narratives grow louder, and without friction, those narratives harden into certainty. Scripture doesn't wait for visible failure to flag danger. It marks the internal shift first, when someone relies exclusively on their own perspective because distance felt easier. Once that threshold is crossed, correction arrives as threat, not information, and reality bends to protect the isolated self. As this inward turn continues, consequences stay invisible because they're psychological before social. The person still functions, works, speaks when required, but something subtle has shifted. They are no longer calibrated by others. The biblical record shows separation preceding misjudgment, not the other way around. Isolation is the condition that allows collapse to unfold without resistance. When disagreement disappears, thoughts stop being tested, and what feels like peace is just unchallenged assumption. Scripture treats voluntary withdrawal as a warning signal, because once someone consistently chooses distance, they mistake comfort for accuracy and confidence for truth. And by the time damage becomes visible to others, the internal shift has already locked in. Isolation reinforces itself. The less a person engages, the more foreign engagement feels, the more justified withdrawal appears. The Bible documents this as a compounding pattern, where separation feeds desire rather than resolves it, and the inward pull grows stronger the longer it goes unchallenged. What starts as avoiding people becomes avoiding exposure, reflection, anything that might interrupt the internal narrative now in control. This is where psychological blindness forms, not through ignorance, but insulation, because without outside reference points, the self becomes the only authority left. Ancient records describe this quietly as a narrowing of influence that happens long before anyone else notices. And once the circle is small enough, nothing from outside can enter without being rejected. Eventually, isolation becomes justification, because distance now feels like proof of insight rather than signal of risk. By this stage, separation is defended, not questioned, and anyone who challenges it is perceived as intrusive or unaware. What began as relief turns into resistance because engagement threatens the internal structure formed in silence. This is why ancient warnings focused on the early movement inward, not the later collapse outward. Because once isolation hardens into identity, the person no longer experiences distance as loss. They experience it as protection. And when protection replaces connection, the final outcome doesn't arrive suddenly. It arrives unnoticed, shaped quietly over time while nothing seems wrong. The Bible never frames isolation as dramatic failure. It frames it as drift, a slow departure that feels intentional and reasonable while happening. By the time separation produces visible consequences, the person involved no longer recognizes those consequences as connected to withdrawal at all. Distance has rewritten cause and effect. What outsiders see as disconnection feels from inside like clarity, safety, finally seeing things as they are. This is why ancient observation treats isolation as an early marker rather than end stage, because once the inward turn fully settles, the individual doesn't feel lost, they feel correct, and correction itself becomes the enemy. At that point, collapse unfolds internally, quietly, with no signal strong enough to interrupt it. By the time isolation reaches this depth, the pattern has completed its most important work. It has removed interruption. The Bible's records consistently show collapse rarely begins with rebellion or chaos. It begins with distance, with a person no longer positioned where warning can reach them. Isolation doesn't feel like absence, it feels like order, because nothing presses against the internal structure anymore. The person still believes they're choosing distance, but the record suggests something darker, that separation has begun choosing them. And this is where the warning becomes most severe, because once influence is gone and correction is filtered out, the next stage doesn't require effort. It happens naturally, quietly, without resistance, while the person remains convinced nothing is wrong. What the ancient record makes clear is isolation doesn't need to be extreme to be effective, it only needs to be consistent. A person doesn't have to disappear to become unreachable, they only need to reduce exposure enough that opposing input stops shaping them. Scripture repeatedly documents separation before consequence, because once a person is no longer located within shared life, shared memory, and shared restraint, their internal logic operates without external limits. At that point, warning sounds like noise, concern feels like interference, and distance feels earned rather than chosen. Nothing dramatic announces this shift, nothing visibly breaks, but the pattern shows once isolation is normalized, the next outcome is already in motion, waiting, developing quietly where no one else can see it. At the final stage, isolation no longer looks like a decision, it looks like normal life, and that's what's dangerous. When separation becomes routine, the person stops noticing what's missing because absence has become familiar. Engagement feels unnecessary, exposure feels risky, and connection feels inefficient. This is the moment ancient warnings linger on without resolving, because nothing collapses outward yet, nothing forces recognition. The individual still feels functional, rational, in control, but the record shows by the time isolation feels invisible, its effect is complete. What follows isn't sudden and it isn't loud. It simply continues, uninterrupted, because no one is close enough anymore to slow it down. The biblical record never marks a clear stopping point, because isolation doesn't end in an event, it ends in continuation. The individual remains intact enough to move forward, but no longer positioned to be reached, and that's the condition the warnings leave unresolved. Scripture documents the state without relief, without reversal, because the danger was never the moment of being alone, it was the moment isolation stopped feeling like something that needed explanation. Once distance no longer raises concern internally, nothing external has leverage. The pattern doesn't close with collapse on the page. It simply leaves a person at the edge of what comes next. Because when separation has done its work, consequences no longer need to arrive forcefully, they only need time.